Hey YouTube, my name is Justin Chalfant. I'm the founder here at PatchMyPC. Our company develops a product that allows you to automatically package and create updates for third-party applications, and we integrate into Microsoft Configuration Manager and Intune. Prior to that, I was also a premier field engineer at Microsoft supporting Configuration Manager and Intune. Before we actually get started into this video, where we're going to be taking a look at hardware inventory, want to try out something new. Recording this on a Sunday, which isn't that typical. Just won a hockey game, so just excited. Want to try something that we haven't done before. So what we want to do is the first 3 commenters, we are going to send a packet of PatchMyPC swag. So for example, things like this hat. But there's one thing I want to call out. We are going to do it initially just to try it out with only people in the United States. Just for shipping reasons, but future videos, maybe we'll see if we can extend that out. We are a global company and know sometimes different countries, it can be a little bit complicated. So just to try things out, we're going to keep it a little bit more simple. First 3 comments on the video, we'll reply and ship you some swag if you're in the United States. So best of luck for that. Now, let me go ahead and turn off the video so we can focus on the content and just jump right in. So jumping in, let's just start with the introduction. So we're actually on the Microsoft Docs website. So at the most basic level, hardware inventory is data that a configuration manager client will collect about a device. So for example, it could be things like what processor is running on it, how much memory is on that computer. One thing that hardware inventory is that it's actually things like installed applications as well. So things like add and remove programs is actually sent up through hardware inventory, which really isn't that obvious because there is this other thing in ConfigMan that we won't be talking about in this video called software inventory. So, at first glance, you would likely think, software inventory would get you things like the installed apps. But software inventory is really about inventorying data about specific files. So for example, you could get additional details for things like EXEs or DLL files, but hardware inventory is actually what includes the more general information like add and remove programs, as well as a lot of other different information. So to give you an idea of what hardware inventory actually looks like, so if you're in the ConfigMan console, we're going to look on this Demo 1 client, and we can right click and click Start, and then Resource Explorer. Then under the hardware expand, we can expand the hardware, and this is actually data that gets collected through hardware inventory. So you can see all kinds of information about a device. So for example, you can see things like what's the hard drive, what is the firmware of the device, network adapters, so what's things like the IP address for the different network adapters on a computer. We can see things like installed applications, so let's take a look at that. What apps actually exist, so things like display name, version, things that you would expect to see if you're looking at add and remove programs. So this is actually collected through hardware inventory and just all kinds of other data. So if we actually want to see what is the type of data getting collected, this is a quick view where you can see the majority of information that is actually coming in through hardware inventory. So that's pretty high level. From a config manager perspective, from an admin perspective, it is enabled by default. So one thing you would want to be aware of is under the client settings, you do have a hardware inventory section. And this is where you can actually configure things like how frequently, well, first of all, is it on? So by default, hardware inventory is on when you install a site. So it's likely on by default. You can also see things like how frequently should it run. So by default, it's 7 days. That's the default schedule. Some sites, maybe you do it every 1 day. We'll actually take a look at this, but there are things like a full hardware inventory cycle, which is what would happen if a client has never submitted hardware inventory. So if you just installed the client, and then everything after that is delta, which would only be an incremental change. So it's pretty minimal, the amount of data and processing that occurs in a delta sync. So for example, many organizations may change this to every 1 day, for example. I'll do that just for our lab environment. There's also some randomization where, depending on where you're at, how many clients you have, it can delay, how frequently it should do it, just to stagger it out. And we're currently on a simple schedule, so it's going to kind of randomize based on the last time it did it anyways. But just, this is where the general configuration about hardware inventory lives within the console. One of the other probably more interesting things that you can configure directly in client settings is what should we actually inventory. So for example, this is mainly things that are enabled by default. So I haven't really configured anything in this lab. So things like, installed applications. That's going to be something that is turned on by default. So it's going to automatically send up data about programs that are installed through add and remove programs, for example. Maybe you wanted to see what kind of data is out there for laptops and their batteries. There are a couple of, there's a lot of things that are built in that are not enabled by default. If there's some kind of custom class and you have a device that already has that open, whatever class that is that you want to collect data from, which would be in WMI or Windows Management Instrumentation, you do have the ability to actually connect to devices. So for example, I could connect to the server, and maybe there's a custom class or namespace that there's some data that you want to collect. Just know that it is possible for you to come in here and you can extend this to collect additional details. The more things that you enable, obviously it's going to have a little bit more space in the database, a little more processing on the client. So just kind of think about what would actually bring you value. You wouldn't want to come in here and select everything if it's not actual data that you would be utilizing in things like reports or things like that. But this is where things are configured. Just want to make sure you know some of the basics before we jump in and actually go pretty deep on the client side, as well as how that data gets submitted up through the management point and processed on the site server. So that's some of the fundamentals. Now we're going to actually go and really dig into this and show you how things work. So, if you're just kind of wondering the basics, you're probably good at this point. But what we're going to do now is really dig into how things occur. So let me just call out, I have enabled verbose logging on my site server. This is not something that you would have to do. This is just so we can see some additional logging on the server when we start to see how things are processed. So the thing I did is I enabled the log level to 0. This is not actually something that you would want to do or leave on because it would require a little bit more processing to write out all the additional logging in verbose on the site server. I've also, on the client, I right-click the client and I enabled the verbose logging. So under client diagnostics, I did turn on verbose logging. So the client also has verbose logging on so that we can get a little bit more details just for the purpose of this video. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go and I'm going to stop a specific component on my site server. So within the console, I'm going to go to Monitoring, Site Status, and then click on Component Status. From here, I'm going to click Start and open the Configuration Manager Service Manager. Now, this is a tool that we can stop specific components that are running on the site server. So these components are also known as threads, and they're threads that are running under the SMS Executive Service, which is really the primary service that allows the site server to do different functions of the site server for a config manager site. Now, what we're going to actually do is we're going to click on the Inventory Data Loader and then right-click and choose Query. Now, what this component is actually responsible for is this is the component that processes inventory submitted through the client up to the management point, and then that gets forwarded to the site server. And then once it does that, this component is responsible for analyzing the file of hardware inventory on a client and then processing it into the database. So within the logs, within my site server, which it would be wherever you install it, so in my case it was the program files, then we have Microsoft Configuration Manager and then logs. And this is going to be the logs for my site server. We're then going to open the dataldr.log, So this is the actual log that is correlating to this inventory data loader component within the site. So I'm going to right click and choose on stop. And within this log, we can actually see that that thread is now exiting and it's no longer running. And the reason that we're going to do that is we're going to actually show when the client submits the hardware inventory up through the management point, by having this component stopped, it won't actually process the file within the inboxes folder, and we'll kind of show what that looks like. But really this is just so we can see some hardware inventory get submitted, and we can do a little bit more analysis without it actually processing the file. Now, depending on every couple minutes, there is a component within the SMS executive that can actually start this back up. It's like a health check monitor. So what I'm going to do is just under services, and if you wanted to, you could simply stop the SMS executive without actually stopping the thread, because that would stop the thread as well. But just want to make sure that I explain from a thread perspective, there's all these different threads that are running, and then wanted to show you the thread that is specific for inventory data loader, which would be what's applicable for hardware inventory. But we're just going to stop that SMS executive to make sure the component doesn't restart, and then process the file before we could see it. Now, looking back at the config.man docs, this is actually where we can see some more details about what that data loader component does. So if we come back under components, under the thread, and if we look at logging, we can see this is in fact the thread that is correlating to dataldr.log. So just quick overview, data loader, and that's going to be what records the processing of hardware inventory. So just a bit more from the Microsoft docs. Now, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to jump over to my client. So this is a client within my config.man site. It's called demo client 1, and we're going to go ahead and run a hardware inventory cycle. So from the client side, there's a log file called inventory. Let's see if we can find it. Inventory agent.log. So I went ahead and clicked on Run Hardware Inventory Scan within the Config Manager properties in Control Panel, and we can see that it's now processing an hardware inventory scan. So what we'll see is on the client side, this can generally take about 10 to 15 seconds before we actually see the agent running things against WMI and saving that data. But what we'll see here is all kinds of different WMI namespaces that are being queried to process any changes. There we go. So we can see it's currently querying and saving things to WMI on the client. So what I've done is I've downloaded a tool. It is called WMI Explorer. It's a free tool from Microsoft. So let me just come over here, go to my downloads, and let me go ahead and open up WMI Explorer as administrator. Okay. Just click connect. All right, so within the log file of inventory agent, we can see things like where namespaces and collection is happening. So for example, we can see the config manager agent in inventory agent.log is actually querying and saving data within the namespace of root CCM INV AGT for inventory agent. So we can actually open up this namespace, and we'll actually see some of the data that's been collected through hardware inventory. So things like the Active Directory site. So this computer is currently part of just the default first site in Active Directory. We can look under computer system. We can see it's part of the Contoso domain. Let's look at IP network adapter, so fully qualified domain name. There's just all kinds of different data that may be stored within this namespace in different instances here. So for example, we can see within this system, here's the name of it. We can see the config manager GUID, how much, what kind of workloads are enabled, what domain it's a part of, just a lot of different data here. There's also some things that happen under here where it stores some additional data under root, SIMv2, and then SMS namespace. From here, things like installed software. So here's all the different products that have been inventoried through hardware inventory. So for example, Visual Studio, all these different products. So Google Updater, Microsoft Edge. So if I were to look at add or remove programs, we can see these different components and things installed are also being collected here through hardware inventory. So just all kinds of different data. There's Google Chrome. But just when the client is actually scanning for hardware inventory or actually saving hardware inventory on the machine, a lot of that's going to be performing actions within WMI or Windows Management Instrumentation on the client. And it's going to be saving that data there. And then that's also going to be the data that gets sent up and processed to the site. So if we look back at the end of this log file, here we go. So we can see this is where it completed, and this is actually a pretty interesting line. So it's saying that it sent the inventory to the management point. So this has forwarded the inventory file, which is a MIF file, up to the management point. So from here, we can also open up another log on the client for CCM messaging. So the CCM messaging would show anything that's occurred with communication to the management point. So we can see, some data within the inventory agent that says, hey, that hardware inventory has been sent up to the management point. But here we can actually see some additional data. So for example, we can see, here's the instance of it connecting to the management point. Here's where it sent up the hardware inventory file. So we can see it's connecting to the management point hardware inventory endpoint. We can see, things like that within the log file. We can see it made the connection. It's attempting to upload hardware inventory to the management point. We can actually see some things like what are the IIS, IIS paths that we're requesting, what path within IIS. And here's where we're actually submitting the upload. So we can see it uploading to the management point within CCM messaging. Now, that's kind of high level what it looks like on the client side. Now, if we jump over, so back on the site server, a couple of things that we can look at here. Now, if we go over on my logs, so these are currently the site server logs, and the SMS executive service is currently stopped. But what we're going to do is, since on this specific config manager site, if we just go and look at it, we actually have the management point also running, and it's co-located with the main site server. So what that means is we also have the management point running on this same machine. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back 2 folders, so Microsoft Configuration Manager and then Program Files. And then there, if it's on the site server, generally it's going to be in the SMS_CCM folder. So these will be the logs that are specific to the management point, which is a site system, which is not, it doesn't have to be on the site server. So that's why the management point logs are actually in a little bit different location in most instances. So there's a file here called the mp_hinv. So this is the log file of the component on the management point that is responsible for receiving and processing hardware inventory from the management side of things. So for example, we can see that, let's just go back to my client. So on the management point, we can see something got sent at 5:38 p.m. And let's go back to the client for a minute. And if we look at the CCM messaging log, we can see 5:38 p.m. and then 23 seconds, I believe, would be the same thing. This is where we can see the transfer completed up to the management point. So if we go back and look on the server, we can see that exact same time, we can see that we have an incoming hardware inventory file from a client, and that's when things start to get processed on the site server. So it's going to forward from the management point, if that's remote from your site server, and then it's going to push that up to the site server. So in our case, we can see that it moves it over to our inbox for the data loader. So what we should hopefully see here is if we open up our installation directory and then we look at inboxes under auth, dataloader.box. This is, so at a high level, the config manager inboxes. This is a folder structure where a lot of components within config manager may move things from the management point up to the inboxes on the site server. And then that's where the site server components for these different boxes will monitor that, and then it can then process things that are flowing into these inboxes into the database. So that's going to be at least how it works for hardware inventory, for example. But these inboxes will function in very similar ways for a lot of different type of actions as well. And if you want to learn more about inboxes, I have another video that talks about the different components that run on the on the site server. So that will be a bit deeper dive where we look at a lot of other common inboxes and how components interact. But for this one, we have the data loader. So here's the actual hardware inventory file that has been sent up to the site server. So if I were to just open this in Notepad++, we can see that this is for the client demo 1. We can see different data, like what's the workstation, what's the operating system. Now, one thing I do want to call out, and this is actually pretty interesting. Let me jump back to the client. Okay. And I'm just going to do a search for the word Delta. So within the inventory agent, when we were actually starting to collect the inventory, we can see that the line that says this is a Delta inventory. So what that means is it's only going to upload what has changed since the last inventory request. And within WMI, let's just take a look over here on the client. If we look at the client, where's CCM? There we go, CCM. Expand that out. And then inventory agent. At the bottom here, we have this status. Now, the status that is specific to hardware inventory is going to be the first one here that ends in 1. We have other types of inventory, such as software inventory, that's different. But this is where we can see what is the last major version for inventory that's been submitted and what's the last minor one. So if we look at inventory agent, you'll actually see that when we started to collect it, this was the major version and this was the minor version. So if we look back at the site server, what we'll notice is overall, this current file is 87 kilobytes. So what I'm going to do for the purpose of comparing that to a full inventory is I'm just going to copy this file into a folder on my desktop, and we'll look at it when we force a full hardware inventory scan on the client to look at some of the differences here. Now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to come back to my services. I'm going to start the SMS executive service. So what we should see here is the data loader. Once that starts up, it starts to process that file. So here we can see it just started up. It detected that there is one file within the data loader inbox. We can see here's that same file that we're looking at. And it needs to be processed. So now we're going to see it is processing the hardware inventory that was submitted up through the management point Here's the version. So we have the major version of 8 and the minor version of 2. That's actually something that we saw on the client when it was collecting and submitting that. And here we can see it starting to commit the changes for that Delta inventory up to the database. So this component processed it, and now it submitted that to the database, and now we're done. And this is where we can see it actually happening. So if we come back to our device, and if we right click and start Resource Explorer, we can now go down to Workstation Status, and then we can see it was just submitted. So it was collected, like 12 minutes ago from the client, and this is going to be the client local time of when that actually got submitted. We can see it's version 8.2, and then this would be everything that has changed in that Delta sync. So generally, it's not going to be all that much data that is involved in a Delta sync. Now, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to do a couple of things. So within IAS, we can see the folder that was actually the virtual folder on IAS that the client was actually submitting hardware inventory to. It was the CCM incoming folder. So this is going to be when a client, a config manager client, collects the inventory on the client side, and when it wants to send it up through the management point, this is actually the IAS component that is storing that. So what I've done is I've got just a tool that I downloaded for monitoring folder changes. I haven't really tested this. I didn't do a lot of research on it, but there's plenty of tools out there. For example, you could use something like Process Monitor, from Microsoft. There's just an easy one that had a GUI where I could just easily come in here and kind of monitor stuff. So what we're going to be monitoring is 2 different folders. We're going to be monitoring the inbox folder for the hardware inventory, and then we're going to also monitor the virtual directory for the IAS component that handles actually the initial receiving of the hardware inventory files, and then moves it into the inboxes folder for the site server to process. So we've got 2 different directories that we're monitoring. Let me go ahead and start that. And then that's going to monitor any changes. Now, what I'm going to do next, I'm going to come back to the client. So what we're going to do here is we're going to force the client to do a full inventory scan. So we're going to do that by opening up a PowerShell window. And before I actually do this, let me just explain a little more about Delta syncs and full syncs. So let's go ahead and do Delta here. So here's where when a client first submits hardware inventory and it's never done it before, that's where it's always a full inventory. So for example, first time it's always going to need everything, but then anything after that would only contain a Delta or things that have changed. So if we come in here and let me just look at that MIF file that we have. And for example, if we go ahead and search Google Chrome, we have nothing in here because there's been no changes to things like installed programs or maybe things like services that contain the text Google Chrome. Nothing has actually changed there. So what we're going to do now is we're going to force the client to do a full inventory scan. So within PowerShell, I'm going to paste in a command. So what we're doing is we're actually going to, within the namespace inventory agent, we're going to actually connect in and we're going to remove the last version history. So this is actually, if we come back to WMI Explorer, this is simply going to delete this instance for hardware inventory. So we can currently see it's 8.2, and that was the major and minor version of inventory from this client. So I'm going to run this command. I'll also I'll include this in the description in case you wanted to test this. There's no real cases where you would ever have to do this. If there was ever an issue in the server, on the site server, if it ever detected there was some kind of mismatch, it would reject the Delta inventory, and then the actual server would force the client to do a full inventory to make sure everything is fully synced and incomplete. But we can force this on the client side, but there's not really a big use case for this. Config-man handles this all for you. All right, so I ran that command. So if I refresh now, we can actually see that instance for the one ending in 001, which is for hardware inventory. We can see that's now deleted. So if we come back in here, and let me actually just go back to the site server for a moment, and let's stop the SMS executive service again so we can have the file not get processed. All right, so coming back to my client, I'm going to go ahead and force hardware inventory. And what we're going to see this time, since it no longer has the last version that was submitted for hardware inventory, it's going to force it to do a full inventory because it doesn't know that it's done inventory before because we deleted that instance. So it's going to think it's essentially a new client and it needs to do an inventory of everything and send that up, not just a delta. So now the inventory agent, similar to a delta, it's running queries to see, is anything changed, and it's saving all that to WMI. And if we open there we go. So we can see it sending it to the management point. So if we go back into CCM messaging, we can see this is where it's actually sending and uploading it to the management point in the CCM incoming website. So if I come back, and let's go back to the site server. And if we look at that file monitoring tool, we can see a couple things happening here. So here is the IIS. So we can see the IIS website. And we can actually see, here we go. So this is the, this is the actual hardware inventory file coming in. Go. So we can see when it's actually being sent from the client to the server, it's about 77 kilobytes. So this is actually a compressed file. It's kind of like a zip file, you can think of it. So it's actually quite a bit smaller when it's sending it up to the management point. But what this essentially is it's what gets moved into the data loader. So we can see here's it being processed through the management point. We can see the IIS website user. We can see it coming into the incoming folder. And then we can see it gets moved and renamed and decompressed. So we can see it then expands out to about 1.22 megabytes for this specific device. And then it gets added to the data loader folder. So if we were to come into data loader, inboxes, auth, data loader. Here's the MIF file, and we can see, let me just copy it to my desktop. We can see this one that is a full inventory scan is about 15 times bigger. So if I were to open up this one because it is full, and if I were to look at Google Chrome, we can see that this one, this is part of the recently used applications. We can see Google Chrome here. Here's the add remove program. So we can see it, add remove programs here in the full inventory scan. We can see Google Chrome. We can see the install date, the MSI product code, the vendor attribute, and then the version number. We can see all of these getting processed and in the inventory file itself when we do a full synchronization. So now if I start up my service again, and if we open up the data loader, we can see that's now been processed. For this one, we can also see on data loader, it's detected that this is a full or resync report. So we can see the version has been incremented to version 9 because it's a new major version. So we can see all of this happening and all of it getting processed into the database. And that pretty much, I think, covers everything that I was interested in showing in this video specific to hardware inventory. So hopefully the video was helpful. Really just wanted to give you a starting with just the general overview of, this is how you look at hardware inventory in the collection. Hardware inventory can also be used for a lot of other things. For example, things like collection queries using WQL. Like if you were to come in and say, let me go look at this. And if you were to use a query for things like the membership rules, you could use a query, and a lot of these will be looking at hardware inventory. So there's a lot of use cases of where this data gets used. A lot of items like installed applications, these would be things that are actually submitted up through hardware inventory. Like if we were building a collection based on, what is a product name that's installed kind of thing, you could configure different queries under the criteria here. So really that was just looking at, how it's used in general, right-clicking a device, looking at installed products, all the different details of a specific computer. On the client side, we looked at how data gets scanned through the inventory agent, how that saves into WMI, how it then creates the file that gets flowed up through the management point in the CCM incoming folder, how that then moves along to the site server, and then that gets processed up in the inbox under the auth and then data loader folder. And then the data loader component will then process that into the database. So if you ever see issues or just, hopefully this was just a good guide for letting you know how that flow works. If you ever had to troubleshoot why hardware inventory isn't making it up, it could be something like the management point isn't running, could be an issue with the data loader component. But yeah, just hope the video was helpful and wanted to thank you for watching.